No other case on American soil, let alone a crime that never happened, has led to as many appeals, trials, and retrials as the Scottsboro Boys case. The 9 young black teenagers from Alabama had their lives ruined after getting accused of raping 2 white women near Scottsboro. The case marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. Despite strong evidence supporting their innocence, all-white juries found 8 of the 9 defendants guilty and sentenced them to death by electric chair, causing national outrage. Here is what happened to the Scottsboro Boys. The 1930s was a time when many things happened. The Great Depression started in 1929 and caused widespread poverty, high unemployment rates, and terrible living conditions. With no savings or jobs, thousands of Americans became homeless. In 1931, President Herbert Hoover made the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. The same year, there was also the Scottsboro trials, a case that shook the nation. During this period, many people found comfort in hoboing. Riding freight trains became a fun adventure, a welcome escape from mundane routines. Others hopped on trains in an effort to find new opportunities. On March 25, 1931, around 24, mostly young men of both white and black descent, came aboard the Memphis freight train. Some of the black teenagers heard rumors about government jobs in Memphis. They would have to haul logs onto the river. Although the wages for such work would have been meager, the teenagers were eager to try it out. On board the train, there were other black teens from different parts of Georgia. White youth were also there. After failing to find work at the cotton mills in Chattanooga, the white youth were on their way back to Huntsville. As the train crossed the Alabama border, one of the white youths stepped on the hands of a black man named Haywood Patterson. Patterson was not alone on that train. His friends quickly took the stand, and a fight broke out. The black youths managed to force most of the white gang members off the train, leaving only one behind. Patterson risked his life by pulling the remaining white youth, Orville Gilley, back onto the train as it accelerated. Some of the expelled whites went to the station master in Stevenson to report an alleged assault by a group of black people. The station master sent a message ahead, and a posse in Paint Rock, Alabama, stopped the train. Armed men surrounded the train. The goal was simple: capture every black teenager you can find. When the police came on board the train, they found something else. 2 white women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, hiding in the train, dressed in men's clothing. The woman immediately accused the 9 black teenagers of raping them. Despite the lack of evidence, raping was considered a massive crime and often came with a death sentence. These captured black teens, who would later be known as the Scottsboro Boys, were tied together with a plow line, loaded onto a flatbed truck, and thrown in jail. The exact reason why Price and Bates fabricated an obvious lie is unknown, but we can guess. By accusing the Scottsboro Boys of they could avoid facing charges of their own, such as being charged with vagrancy, having no permanent residence or means of support, or violating the Mann Act, crossing state lines for immoral purposes. These charges could have been brought against them when they were rounded up by the posse in Paint Rock. Bates later admitted that when she withdrew her testimony and stated that the rape did not happen. Also, at the time, the young women probably wanted to get even with some of the black boys who forced their boyfriends out of the train. Before the incident, only 4 of the black boys had known each other. This was the beginning of the Scottsboro case that lasted for several years, spanning from 1931 to 1937. Haywood Patterson, Ozzie Powell, Eugene Williams, Charlie Weems, Willie Roberson, Olin Montgomery, Clarence Norris, and brothers Leroy and Andrew Wright were taken to the local county seat to await trial. News quickly spread and the white community was furious. A large crowd of more than 100 people gathered around the jail in Scottsboro. They wanted to lynch the accused boys without a fair trial. Luckily, their plans were destroyed when the governor of Alabama, Benjamin Meek Miller, dispatched the National Guard to keep the boys safe. It's truly crazy what they went through. Stories like these are exactly why we made our ebook called The Root. It breaks down our real history, the traps that keep us stuck in the system, and how to become the best versions of yourself. It'll cost you less than a meal at Chipotle if you'd like to support. Everything goes back into making high-level documentaries like these. Click the first link in our description to grab yours now. Thank you. Now let's get back into it. March 30th, 1931. The grand jury formally charges the boys with the crime of rape. When a grand jury indicts someone, it means that they have reviewed the evidence presented and have enough proof to proceed with the trial. But there were no signs of rape on Price or Brace's bodies. April 6th, 1931. The trial begins. Judge A.E. Hawkins was assigned to the case. April 7th to April 9th, 1931. Haywood Patterson, Willie Roberson, Olin Montgomery, Clarence Norris, Eugene Williams, Charlie Weems, and Ozzie Powell were found guilty and given the death penalty. Roy Wright's trial ended without a verdict when certain jurors insisted on the death penalty, despite the prosecution's request for a life sentence. According to the Associated Press, the boys were composed and unemotional as the judge sentenced them to die by electric chair. Well, to be honest, they probably knew what was coming. This marked a critical step in the legal proceedings and thrust the case into the national spotlight. The indictment not only placed the Scottsboro Boys in imminent danger, but also intensified the racial divisions within the community and the nation as a whole. Supporters of the defendants, along with civil rights organizations and activists, rallied to their defense, questioning the validity of the charges and highlighting the deep-rooted prejudices and inequalities present in society. The death penalty for the Scottsboro Boys set the stage for a long and arduous legal battle that would span several years and involve numerous trials, appeals, and public demonstrations. It marked a critical juncture in a case that would ultimately expose the systemic injustices faced by all Black people and serve as a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Telegrams and countless letters poured into the courts, county, governor, attorney general, the president, and Congress to release the young Black men. People all across the country organized mass protests, demonstrations, and boycotts to free the Scottsboro Boys. April to December 1931, the International Labor Defense and NAACP fought for the right to represent the boys. The ILD was established in 1925 with the sole purpose to oppose organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and handle controversial, high-profile cases like Bartolomeo Vanzetti and Nicholas Sacco. The NAACP was one of the nation's well-known civil rights groups established in 1909. When the NAACP decided to join the legal battle, they found that the ILD had already taken on the case. This led to both groups launching campaigns to discredit each other. The NAACP accused the ILD of exploiting the Scottsboro case for communist propaganda, while the ILD saw the NAACP as too moderate, eager to comprise with the ruling class for small benefits. Both organizations had their impact, but in the end, the ILD won over the boys' parents. This had a decisive impact on the outcome. June 22, 1931, the death sentence was temporarily postponed while the defendants filed an appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court. The executions cannot proceed until the higher court reviews and decides on the appeal. July 10, 1931. On the scheduled day of their own planned executions, the Scottsboro Boys listened to the execution of Willie Stokes, who was the first among 10 African Americans to be executed at the prison in the next 10 years. After the Scottsboro Boys heard disturbing and horrifying accounts of Willie's final moments, many of them couldn't sleep. They had horrible nightmares, which had a massive psychological impact. Communist parties in other nations also organized protests and gatherings to advocate for the release of the boys. For example, in July 1931, there was a rally of 150,000 German workers, where Wright delivered a speech in a desperate attempt to save her sons. January 5, 1932, Ruby Bates wrote a letter to Earl Streetman, her boyfriend at the time. She claimed that the police forced her to make a false statement and expressed her desire to clear her name and told Earl that she loves him. She also admitted to being drunk at the time of the incident and was hanging with the white boys, not the black boys. So, she didn't want the black boys to be hurt because of her. March 1932. The Alabama Supreme Court, with a majority vote of 6-1, upheld the guilty verdicts of 7 of the Scottsboro Boys, but the court determined that Eugene, being underage at the time, can't be held fully responsible for his actions. May to November 1932. Because of process violations, the Supreme Court decided to intervene and review the case. It was concluded that the black boys didn't receive a fair trial because they didn't have enough time to prepare, and their lawyers were incompetent in many ways. For example, their defense lawyers wanted to have all 9 defendants tried together, even though it could harm Roy Wright, the youngest among them at the age of 12. The prosecution, however, chose to try the defendants in smaller groups. During the trial, Victoria Price testified that the defendants threatened to harm them if they didn't comply. However, her cross-examination lasted only a few minutes, and the examining doctors were not questioned at all. Neither did they question any of the contradictions between Price's testimony and Ruby Bates's testimony. The defense called only the defendants as witnesses, but their testimonies were confusing, sometimes made no sense at all, and were filled with obvious misstatements. May 8, 1933. A massive group of 4,000 people marched for 6 miles through the streets of Washington, D.C. in the middle of a rainy day. They called for the release of the Scottsboro Boys. March to April 1933. The second trial of Haywood Patterson took place in Decatur. Judge James Horton was assigned to the case. Here, Ruby Bates withdrew her testimony. Nevertheless, a couple days later, Patterson was found guilty and given the death penalty. This caused another public outrage. Thousands of Black Americans joined hundreds of white supporters at Mount Carmel Baptist Church. Ruby addressed the crowd and joined the protests. The demonstrators also advocated for the freedom of labor leader Tom Mooney, Ewell Lee, an African American facing the death sentence, and Angelo Herndon, a Black communist labor organizer charged with rebellion in Georgia. President Franklin Roosevelt declined to meet with the delegation. This angered the demonstrators, but it didn't force them to give up. Instead, representatives prepared a petition with 155,000 signatures to the White House Appointments Secretary. The crowd paused their march and gathered outside the White House, where they sang and chanted, "Free the Scottsboro Boys." These demonstrations forced the judge to postpone the rest of the trials. June to December 1933. All the efforts seemed to pay off. Well, at least for a little while. Judge Horton overturns Haywood Patterson's conviction and orders a new trial. In October, the Scottsboro cases were no longer in the hands of Judge Horton and were moved to the courts of Judge William Callahan. But this victory was short-lived. In the winter, Clarence Norris and Haywood Patterson were charged with convicted and received the death sentence. June to October 1934. Judge Horton, who had not encountered any opposition in his previous election, failed in his attempt to be re-elected. In October, 2 attorneys were accused of trying to bribe Victoria Price to try and persuade her to change her testimony. February to December 1935. Samuel Leibowitz appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court. He explained that there was not enough black jurors in Jackson County who would defend the interests of the black community. He presents the justices with jury rolls containing fake names, and they examine the inks on the page with a magnifying glass. On April 1st, in the case of Norris versus Alabama, the Supreme Court rules that excluding black individuals from jury rolls violates their right to equal protection under the law, as stated in the 14th Amendment. The case is overturned and sent back to a lower court. Patterson's case is not argued due to technicalities and filing dates, but the court strongly urges the lower courts to review his case given the circumstances. In December, both Leibowitz and the ILD are seen as burdens for the defendants, leading to a reorganization of the defense. The Scottsboro Defense Committee is established, chaired by Allen Knight Chalmers, and local attorney Clarence Watts is appointed as co-counsel. January to December 1936. On January 23rd, Patterson is convicted and given a 75-year prison sentence. The next day, during the transfer to Birmingham jail, Ozzie Powell attacks Deputy Edgar Blaylock with a knife and cuts his throat. Sheriff Jay Sandlin intervenes, shooting Powell in the head. Both Blaylock and Powell survive. In December, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Knight, who served as the prosecuting attorney, met Leibowitz in New York to discuss a potential agreement. May to December 1937. In May, Thomas Knight passed away. In the summer, Clarence took charge of the defense. Andy Wright was convicted and sentenced to 99 years. Charlie Weems was given a 75-year sentence. Ozzie Powell pleaded guilty to assaulting Blaylock and received a 20-year sentence, but the charges were dropped. In the winter, Governor Bibb Graves met with Allen Knight Chalmers to talk about offering clemency to the 5 convicted Scottsboro boys. In the years that followed, some of the boys were granted parole and released, but their lives would never be the same. In 1944, Andy Wright and Clarence Norris were released, but violated their parole and were sent back to jail shortly after. In 1946, Ozzie Powell was released, and Norris received another parole. Patterson's fate was a lot more cruel. Because he was left with no other option, he escaped from prison in 1948, but in 1951, he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced back to prison. In 1976, Clarence Norris received a pardon. Charges, even today, fit a particular pattern. There's a misconception that black men always prey on white women, when in fact, in some cases, the opposite is true. Throughout history, black people were victimized by white men. This has been going on for generations and generations. The Scottsboro Boys were spared their electric chair, but they rotted in prison for many years. Even after their release, many of them never really recovered from the traumatic experience. Their story is truly a tragedy. These boys never got to experience their teens or live a life of freedom. They were stuck in a cell over something they never did. This story was truly heartbreaking, but it's one that needed to be told. Like and subscribe to the channel so you can join the movement. We aren't just making documentaries, we're changing lives and waking the people up. Click the video on the screen to learn some more black history they never taught you in school. We'll see you over there.